Welcome to Emerging Opportunities, the show where we stretch your investment horizons across the globe. I'm Gavin Serkin, and today I've picked a place that, to me at least, stands out in emerging markets for being in a particular sweet spot. While it's often referred to as a zero-sum game, the US-China trade war, along with the current situation of talks to try to find a solution, arguably points to benefits for one country. Chinese companies have been relocating there in order to skirt US sanctions. But the country is also a big beneficiary of Chinese economic growth. That country is China's southern neighbour, Vietnam. But Vietnam is also a country with its fair share of problems, not least concern right now over a possible succession at the top of the Communist Party amid rumours that President Trong may be in poor health. With me in the IG studio for a deep dive into Vietnam are three leading regional experts. Kevin Snowball is the founder, CEO and Chief Investment Officer of PXP Asset Management, the oldest listed equity fund manager in Vietnam. PXP, that is, as opposed to Kevin, who, as you can see, is a mere spring chicken. Mike Sell is head of Asian equities at Alquity, which invests in global emerging markets using ESG or environmental, social and governance principles. And Amy Reynolds is the lead Asia analyst at Sibylline, a global strategic risk consultancy. We'll take a look at the wider Asia region with elections in India, Indonesia, and of course the aftermath from the horrific bombings in Sri Lanka. But Amy, first of all, let's take a look at Vietnam. First of all, what's your reading on the current political situation and the succession risk that I just mentioned? You know, do we risk springing from what is a market-friendly environment right now and one that's had an anti-corruption drive to something that's perhaps a little bit more risky for investors?
Yeah, ultimately, I don't think there are any major risks in this regard. The issue of succession is currently pretty topical in Vietnam. It's around the time at the moment, 2 years ahead of the party conference, that the government would start to think about possible successors to Trong anyway. And as you say, given the rumours in recent weeks of Trong's ill health that were then confirmed by the government last week, there may be need to kind of expedite this process a little bit. And I think while there are no clear and obvious candidates to step in for Trong at the moment, I think it's highly likely that the government will find somebody from the current dominant conservative faction who will be able to step in quite seamlessly and fill Trong's boots and very much kind of continue with the policy agenda that we're seeing at the moment.
So even if we do have succession, perhaps not a significant fear for concern of instability. What about the news that we've seen about the arrest of the brother of Vietnam's richest businessman? Does that hold concern for you of government perhaps meddling into business?
Yeah, the arrest of Vu, I think, is just kind of the latest step in General Secretary Trong's ongoing and extensive and in this case quite far-reaching and daring corruption crackdown. As you mentioned, Vu is the brother of Vietnam's richest man. And I think naturally this creates a kind of sense of insecurity in business and political circles, yes.
Mike, I want to ask you, because you're an environmental, social governance lens that you apply to investment, how do you do this in a country like Vietnam where, you know, they're on rankings, it does rank as one of the more corrupt countries. How do you perhaps keep your nose clean in a country like that?
I think the answer to that is to understand the companies really, really well, both from the financial perspective, as most investors do, but also, as you say, from the ESG, the non-financial perspective. And the way you do that is meet management frequently and undertake a significant amount of desk-based research. Basically, are the management aligned with our interests as minority shareholders? Do they look after their workforce? Do they look after the environment? Are they aligned with us? And that's the way to create sustainable returns and better returns over the medium term.
Give us an illustration, if you can, by looking into some of the stocks maybe that wouldn't meet this kind of tough criteria that you have on ESG, and some of the ones that do, that maybe top your list?
So some of the largest companies are property companies in Vietnam, and for us they don't meet our standards of transparency. We can't work out what's going on in the black box with the related party transactions and so forth. So we rule those out. Elsewhere there's some of the banks, and there's one actual property company that does meet our criteria called Nam Long. The reason that one is different is it's had the IFC working with them for a number of years, and so the levels of ethics, transparency have really filtered throughout the management. However, our main holding in Vietnam is a bank called Vietcombank. Now, that is majority owned by the government, but they have always clearly stated they want this bank to be the shining example of corporate governance, not just in Vietnam, but throughout Southeast Asia. And having owned the company for almost 5 years, they've not put a foot wrong. And so that would be our top idea in Vietnam.
Kevin, I want to ask you for your perspective on this, because you've been in Vietnam for over 15 years now. How does it look on the ground in terms of what we've just been talking about, corruption, succession risk?
Well, there's definitely an ongoing crackdown on corruption led by the President cum General Secretary of the party, Mr. Trung, who has unfortunately been ill recently. I think the implications of Mr. Vu, the brother of Vietnam's richest man, Mr. Vuong, based on their fraternal relationship and not necessarily anything more than coincidence in this case, because the transaction that is being questioned through Mr. Vu's involvement was in fact extremely questionable. However you look at it, the massive overpaying by Mobifone, the country's second biggest mobile phone operator, for a company which was owned by undisclosed people, but probably 100 times what it was worth. That's a questionable transaction on its own. In terms of succession, I agree entirely with Amy that 2 years before the next set of elections, or just under 2 years before the next set of elections, is the time that they would be starting to look at succession issues. So I think the fact that Mr. Trung has unfortunately been ill is not necessarily a negative. It may in fact speed up the search for his successor, because he is mid-70s now, which is 10 years beyond the normal retirement age. So we weren't expecting him to continue in any event. So
The political issue that we're obviously looking at are the US-China trade talks, and as I mentioned before, Vietnam is kind of a beneficiary in that, because we've seen Chinese factories relocating to Vietnam to skirt sanctions. On the other hand, Vietnam relies on China to a huge extent for its exports. How does all of that look from your perspective?
Well, as far as the different views of where we go in relation with, the so-called trade wars, if there is an agreement between China and the US and trade resumes, then Vietnam, as a major exporter, will obviously continue to benefit. If the trade discussions don't come to anything, I think there has been a realization that the global supply chain is in danger of being disrupted, and if you have all of your production in China and there's a disagreement between China and the US, as there has been recently, then obviously you are quite likely to suffer. If you move part of that production to Vietnam, as a number of companies, both Chinese and international, have done, then you'll avoid the tariffs. So I think Vietnam benefits either way, and from that perspective.
Okay, one of the big nuggets for a Vietnam investor like you would be if MSCI decides to upgrade Vietnam from where it is now in the frontier markets basket to the emerging markets basket or index, which is tracked by $1.6 trillion of funds. What is the prospect of MSCI making that move to upgrade Vietnam perhaps in the next couple of years?
Well, we're perhaps alone in thinking that there is a possibility that Vietnam will be added to the MSCI Emerging Market Index watch list this June, so next month, or in 6 weeks' time, in effect. And we think that's partly because Vietnam deserves it on its own merits, having come as far as it has over the last, certainly 44 years, but more recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, has become a market that larger international institutional investors are taking more seriously. We're saying that it might. We think that it could. We think that it should because of a lack of really viable alternatives. The only other country that ever gets mentioned is Kuwait. But I think that after the relative failure of the last two upgrades, with Saudi Arabia perhaps politically being added to the index in order to help get away the world's largest IPO, which is now not going to happen, and Argentina perhaps being put onto the watch list too late in its economic cycle. Vietnam, on its merits, deserves it. I think MSCI needs a win because it needs a country that will continue to grow beyond its admission to the index. So I think it's entirely possible.
So Vietnam deserves it. It might. It could. It should. What does Vietnam actually need to do in order to convince the MSCI? I.e., if you're looking at this from an investor perspective, what are the signposts that you'd be thinking, oh yeah, that's what they needed to do. Now they're going to get there.
I think more easier foreign access. So we do have, in effect, we have foreign ownership limits of 49% for everything except banks and possibly telecoms, 30% for banks and telecoms. Making it easier for companies to remove their foreign ownership limits or relax them at least, and also the insisting that companies release corporate announcements simultaneously in both Vietnamese and English, so that there isn't an advantage through one group of investors over another. And if you're going to internationalize a market, then having English English translations is obviously very helpful to international investors.
Okay, and in terms of money flows, the bonus that might come into Vietnam, what does that look like?
Well, if Vietnam were 0.1% of the emerging market index, that would imply 0.1% of 1.6 trillion is 1.6 billion. Oh, sorry, 1.6 billion is 1.6 trillion is 1.6 billion. That compares with, in 2017, inflows of 900 million. In 2018, 1.9 billion. And that was more than the 1.9 billion came from 2 IPOs. But Vietnam would be, at the last estimate, about 0.7% of the MSCI Emerging Index, which would imply about $10 billion coming into the market from passive investors alone, which would certainly, from a weighted money perspective, tend to suggest that the market might go higher.
So you're in Vietnam, you've got the whole market index open to you. How do you approach stock picking? What kinds of decision processes go into the mix for you?
Well, we're very much a qualitative investor. We're fundamental bottom-up investors. There's nothing we have to own. So out of the top 10 by market cap, we only own 1. Out of the top 20, we only own 3. We have a much broader coverage of the market than certainly the sell side and probably most of the buy side as well. So we're looking in areas that other people aren't looking. And as I say, given that there is nothing we have to own, we can be much more selective in terms of, having a very, very strong focus on best corporate governance practice.
Okay, and Kevin, top 3 picks in Vietnam?
I would have to go with our top 3, well, in fact 3 of our top 4 holdings. Hoa Phat Group is an integrated steel producer. It's extremely cheap, on about 7.5 times this year's earnings. Followed by Vinamilk, which is the state dairy monopoly, which has suffered recently from a slight weakening in its growth trajectory. But the number 1 pick, although it is at the foreign ownership limit, the only one of those 3 that is, FPT, which is a software, IT and telecommunications company, again extremely cheap, extremely well run, very good management and corporate governance, and probably my favourite stock of the 3.
Okay, stay on the line. We're going to come back to you, but I want to turn from Vietnam to broaden out. In Asia, nobody could have failed to notice the world's biggest election going on in India right now. Amy, what's your take? What's the outlook for President Modi here?
Yeah, in line with what the polls are suggesting at the moment, I think it is likely that Modi and the BJP will win a second term, albeit this will likely be with a smaller majority than he did in 2014. While the opposition Congress Party continues to suffer from a lack of internal cohesion, they have succeeded in mounting a kind of more coherent challenge this time round. And I think for policy, broad continuity is the name of the game here, really. Modi's going to continue to court foreign investment in order to boost infrastructure development and to bring along India's industrialization in what's still largely a rural economy. And also to create jobs. India is currently suffering from the highest unemployment rate in 40 years, I think. So there will continue to be considerable opportunities for foreign firms in India, as I see it.
And Mike, how does that look to you from, your perspective, looking at Asia overall in terms of equities? Put India in context. Is it an opportunity as you see it?
I'd wholeheartedly agree. India and Vietnam are two of the greatest opportunities across the asset class, and I'd say the whole emerging market asset class, over the next 3 to 5 years without any shadow of a doubt.
Top picks in India?
Two. I think India's becoming quite a favourite topic of investors, but for us it's about governance and it's about domestic structural growth stories. So we own V-Mart, which is a retailer focusing on the smaller cities. They have a sustainable competitive advantage. There's very little competition there at that price point, and the management are very aligned with minority shareholders. Secondly, a cement company such as Heidelberg Cement. The demand-supply situation for cement, whether it's from housing, infrastructure, factories, is very, very favourable. It's a once-in-a-decade opportunity. And so areas like this will do very well as Modi gets re-elected.
Okay, and we're seeing almost as big an election just happened in Indonesia. Widodo was the winner there. Continuity, more of the same in Indonesia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is very much the case. It's quite similar to India in the sense that I think, despite the fact that during the campaign, Jokowi was espousing a bit of sort of protectionist rhetoric, I don't think this is likely to reflect what he does with his second term. I think he's going to continue to seek to attract foreign investment, also focusing on infrastructure development, as well as kind of trying to facilitate investment more broadly in Indonesia. So to kind of some of the second cities like Surabaya and Bandung to spread the benefits of foreign capital away from just Jakarta.
And Mike, how does Indonesia, India and Vietnam, you were saying were your favourites. How does Indonesia fare?
It's intriguing. Having invested in Asia for 25 years, 10, 15 years ago, everyone talked about Indonesia, and it's dropped off many investors' radar screens in favour of India and Vietnam. And that's right, but that is to miss some of the great opportunities there that I think will come more to the fore with Jokowi's second term, as he does do more reform than people expect. So for us, the main holding is Bank Mandiri, which is a very well-run bank, which is misunderstood by the market. There's also a number of interesting mid-caps, whether that's in the paper space, in the consumer space, that we also have started looking at that are quite intriguing, and it's an area we expect to add to in our portfolios over the next 3 to 6 months.
Okay, and I want to spend some time looking at Sri Lanka because, away from the politics, you've had a situation where obviously there's risk of terrorist threat reoccurring. You've also got a situation where the politics are simply becoming more divisive in a country that is still recovering from an almost 30-year civil war. How does Sri Lanka look from your perspective in terms of the terror risk and also the overall political risk in the country?
Yeah, well, I think the terror risk definitely does remain elevated at the moment, both in the short term with the possibility of follow-up militant attacks, as well as going further forward. There's been a clear demonstration of an interest and influence in Sri Lanka among transnational jihadist groups. The political situation in Sri Lanka has been in disarray for some time, to be honest. There was a constitutional crisis there last year with a 2-month period where there were 2 prime ministers at the same time. And then against this backdrop, of course, you have the Easter Sunday attacks. And I think over the past week, the level of confusion and chaos in governance there has become further elevated. The blame game has been thrown around with regard to the failure to heed the warnings about the attacks. And there's been finger pointing and reshuffling of ministerial positions. And I honestly think that even after the dust settles on the recent attacks, it's going to be quite some time before we see stability in Sri Lankan politics again.
And Sri Lanka was already a stock market that was getting beaten up. There was a lot of frustration that there wasn't direction from the government. Mike, I don't know how your holdings look in Sri Lanka or did before the attacks. Give us some perspective from the investor point of view.
So we exited from Sri Lanka earlier in the year, and for very similar reasons to what Amy was saying, the level of political dysfunctionality. Now that's well discounted in the market. Valuations in Sri Lanka are very, very cheap. But looking forward, there's no sign of that changing until we get through another electoral cycle. So for us, there's better places to put our money, such as Vietnam, India, or even somewhere like Pakistan.
And the electoral cycle is fairly unpredictable in Sri Lanka, given the events before the terror attacks, the split between the president and the prime minister, the recalling parliament, and all of those shenanigans. Do you have an outlook politically of what the election process looks like from here?
I think it's something we need to watch and wait and see how it develops over the next 12 to 18 months. There has been so much volatility even before recent events. I think it's just one to stay clear of for the time being.
Okay. Amy, we look at China all the time from a prospect of deal between Trump and Xi. How it's the ultimate question here. Give us a date. When's it going to happen?
Oh, I wish I could, the magic answer. No, unfortunately, I can't be as specific as that. Trade talks are ticking along in the background at the moment, and there's a lot of volatility in this. One minute it seems like a deal is imminent, the next minute all these kind of issues to do with enforcement mechanisms and the timing of tariff removals return to the surface. I ultimately do think it's likely that we will have a deal, possibly within the coming months. However, I think that any deal that's going to be viable to both parties is going to focus purely on the least contentious aspects, so things like trade deficit reduction and purchase quotas. With regard to China's economic policies and practices that the US perceive as fundamentally unfair, I don't think there's going to be any agreement with regard to significant change here. I think that China will continue to subsidize domestic firms to the disadvantage of their foreign competitors. I think that China will continue to access foreign firms' intellectual property through one means or another. So I ultimately think the arrival at some kind of deal isn't going to change the playing field for foreign companies operating in China.
So do you think when there is a deal, ultimately it's going to be a disappointment to the market from that perspective, that nothing that much will change?
I think there'll definitely be a positive reaction, almost a kind of relief rally, the fact that any deal at all has been secured. And it will also mean kind of relief to the sectors that have been most affected by the tariffs. They've been facing acute economic strain for some time. But with regard to the longer term situation for foreign firms operating in China and all these kind of concerns that have been held in the US for some time that have almost been the underlying causes of the whole issue, I don't think anything's really going to change. So, initially positive, but beyond that, probably not so much.
Okay, so taking this away from how maybe the developed world markets look at the Trump-Xi talks, how does it look on the ground in China, Mike? How do you go about stock selection? And I'm also conscious from your ESG, environmental social governance lens, China sometimes isn't the easiest place to work.
You're absolutely right, and for us governance is a key problem in China. Combine that also, we want to invest in companies for the long term that have long-term structural drivers, such as the increasing levels of urbanisation, such as the ageing population. So unlike many other people, we've steered clear of some of the companies, such as Alibaba, which doesn't meet our standards for governance. And we focused on some of the property names. So Yuzhou Property has good governance, very attractive valuations, and benefits from the trend of Chinese wanting a house of their own and no longer wanting to live with their parents. Or whether it's sportswear or insurance. There are these needles in the haystack of a few very well-run companies in China that are driven by very different factors from global trade wars.
Okay, so tech sector is, if I can generalise, maybe is perhaps one of the more difficult for you. Property would be a more straightforward
Selectively.
Selectively.
I think the secret in China, it's about meeting the companies frequently over a period of years and decades to really test the management, see them in their own offices, and to make sure it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk. And so selective property companies, avoiding companies that are government linked because they're run in the interests of the Communist Party rather than us as minority shareholders. It's a stock picker's market, basically.
The market, the talks that we're all also watching is between Kim and Trump. Now Putin getting involved last week. How does that all look from your perspective? Is Putin helping to resolve North Korea?
Well, yes, Kim and Putin met last week. It all seemed to be pretty amicable. I think what Kim was hoping to get out of it is basically just showing the West that he still has powerful allies, even after sort of diplomatic efforts have kind of ground to a halt with the US. And I think he's also looking for kind of an agreement on sanctions relief, which he didn't really achieve, but there's some pretty convincing evidence that this is going on behind the scenes anyway. And in terms of the outcomes, I think Kim meeting with Putin the same week that North Korea conducted its first weapons test in 5 months, I think just serves to reiterate that a more hostile stalemate is returning between North Korea and the US. And this is likely to perpetuate over the coming months, potentially marked with further weapons tests, a return to more belligerent rhetoric, cyber intrusions, and things like this.
Okay, Kevin, I want to take it back to you now. Thanks for waiting patiently down the line there. But of course, the earlier talks with Kim happened in Vietnam. You were there. What was it like on the ground? And has it left any kind of benefit for Vietnam from hosting those high-level talks? And what did it say about Vietnam that it was chosen to be the host?
Well, I think that taking the last bit first, you know, the fact is that Vietnam has cordial relationships with pretty much every country in the world, and I think came out of the Trump-Kim talks, you know, extremely well. It certainly was on the front pages of the world's news media for a considerable amount of time. I think that you know, the fact that Vietnam did such a good job of hosting those talks reflected very well. You know, and I think you know, the main benefit is that more people found out where Vietnam is and what a wonderful place it is.
Do you think, you know, given your time as a fund manager again, you could see yourself investing at some point in North Korea?
I think I'm probably a little bit old for that, given that it's not imminent. I wouldn't have thought that they open a stock market, and I've always been a listed equity investor.
Okay, a realist out there in Vietnam. Thank you, Kevin. I want to thank Amy Reynolds at Sibylline, Mike Sell from Alquity, and Kevin Snowball of PXP Vietnam Asset Management. I'm Gavin Serkin, and I'll be back with more emerging opportunities on IG soon. In the meantime, if there's a market you'd like us to focus on, or if you have questions for any of our guests, please do get in touch on Twitter at @GSerkin and follow us on IGTV. See you next time.